This is Chapter 6, Section 3, Republicans Defined and Challenged. So after the War of American Independence ended, the Founding Fathers decided that they wanted to establish a republic. That's the type of government they wanted in America. Republic means rule by the people through elected representatives. So American republicanism was not just a form of government. It was a social philosophy and a way of life in America. And they introduced this idea of republican virtue, which means working for the common good. And it promoted people working for public interest rather than self-interest. What's good for America? What's good for your community? Not necessarily what's good for you personally. But Republican virtue raised a lot of ethical questions about slavery. During and after the American Revolution, there was an increased awareness of the inequalities in society. And that motivated some individuals and groups to call for the abolition of slavery and greater political democracy in this new state and in the new state and national governments. So the constitutional framers postponed a solution to the problem of slavery and the slave trade. Basically, by doing this, they set the state for recurring conflicts over these issues in the later years. They didn't want to deal with it, so we're going to have to deal with it later on down the road. Abigail Adams, who is the wife of John Adams, who will later become the second president, she was one of these people that really did promote the abolition of slavery. She has a quote here. It says, "To fight ourselves for what we are daily robbing and plundering for those who have as good a right to freedom as we have." So she's saying, it doesn't make sense that we fought for our freedom. We didn't want to be oppressed, yet we are doing it to other people. We are doing it to the slaves. Also, there were many slaves that fought in the war for the patriot cause with the promise of freedom after the war. They were told, if you join the military and fight for the patriots, you'll gain your freedom. People also questioned slavery on an intellectual level. The enlightened thinkers felt that the oppression of Africans in America was what kept them in a state of inferiority. They weren't inherently inferior. It's not something they were born with, but it was the fact that the Americans kept them as slaves that made them inferior. So what you'll see happening towards the late 1700s is that the northern states started to make plans to emancipate or free their slaves. Not all of them did, but you do see some instances of northern states freeing slaves by the end of the 1700s. But many southern planters felt that slavery was a necessary evil for maintaining their lifestyles, that they couldn't have these large plantations and produce as much agriculture as they were producing without the help of slaves. They called it a necessary evil, but it's just because they didn't want to pay anybody to do that same type of work. So we already, even at the very beginning of our nation, we start to see the separation of the two regions, the North and the South, over this issue of slavery. Women were also asking for their rights after the War of Independence was over. Mary Wollstonecraft is an example of this. She's an early feminist, and she was influenced by the Enlightenment, as many people were. And she felt that women were not inherently inferior. Their genetic makeup did not make them inferior. It was their lack of education that put them in an inferior position, because they weren't given the same opportunities to be educated as men were, that it made them inferior. And so she called for for that to change. She has a famous book that she wrote called A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And we're going to read some excerpts from this. But basically she was calling for rights for women in her writing. Also, going back to Abigail Adams, she was another proponent of women's rights. She writes a lot of letters to her husband John when they are framing the Constitution, asking him to remember the ladies, remember our contribution to the war effort, and give us some rights when all of this is said and done. And so you'll get to read some of those as well. But anyway, their requests, women's requests, were largely ignored. This was still a patriarchal society. The war didn't change that, and so their requests were ignored. But in the late 1790s, some states did begin to grant girls equal rights to schooling. And so girls became more literate and knowledgeable. And eventually, as time goes on, you're going to see it open up more and more, and they're going to start going to high school and start going to college. But for now, this is just the start of it. So some states are granting equal rights as far as late as the 1790s. Also, we're going to see after the Revolution a movement toward the separation of church and state. During the time that Britain ruled over America, we saw how destructive that could be when you have different religions all living in one country, and there could be a lot of rebellion and things like that. And so they don't want to. Our founding fathers did not want any more taxes that supported a particular church. They wanted people to have freedom of religion, freedom to worship as they pleased. They also don't want religion to have any bearing on the government. So they don't want citizens to have to be a church member in order to vote or run for office. And they also said that all churches would be equal before the law. One church will not rule over another, and one church will not get preferential treatment over another.